Like what you said, I didn't fully understand what you were saying about America, but I liked your conclusion.
Really? You didn't understand what I'm saying?
Because I didn't really understand the China firms thing. Like that was too economic and technical for me, so I just skipped over it and just got to the end of your thread.
The story is that like we're manufacturing in America again, and I don't know what the statistic was, like year on year factory openings in America, like up by 116%.
116?
Yeah. And like
Okay.
onshoring is happening. And the idea behind it was that for all the talk about, policy prescriptions and everything about, we need to do this because we need to help America and patriotism and, all the working class stuff of people trying to explain Trump and all the sort of stuff where Biden tried to ape Trump with this whole sort of foreign policy for the middle class and whatever. None of that matters. Ultimately, it was like price signals from COVID, the disruption to the supply chain. Arguably, Trump's sort of belligerence to China did it partly, but even that didn't do it. It was basically events and sort of economic circumstances now pushing America to actually be more resilient than pretty much anywhere else. I mean, I'm particularly just comparing it to Europe, where they're still just talking about what are they going to do about China, how are they going to do reshoring and friendshoring and all this shit. Meanwhile, American industry year on year is like, it's on the case, and not because of any policy being done, not because what any intellectual said. It's just happening because it has to happen. That's all. So that was the idea.
A great philosopher once said, I believe, or was it Winston Churchill? Events, dear boy.
Yeah.
Events.
Yeah. I don't know. Was that Churchill? Might have been Churchill. I don't think it was Churchill. Actually.
I think it was a British person.
It was a Brit.
But so you're basically saying then that I think why this argument is appealing to you is because it's not about ideas,
right?
And I think it's fair to say, Demir, that you've long been of the opinion that ideas are overrated.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's a hobby horse of mine, as you know, and I just come back to it. So when something makes me think of it, I just sort of go for it and try and put it out there and see if there's any traction, because I think it is a deeply offensive idea to like literate people like ourselves, right? That we actually don't matter. That like all the stuff that we come up with and all these thoughts and stuff and plans and all the rest of it, that actually in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter. And I remember it was the real sort of inspiration for this thread is Walter Russell Mead's book, God and Gold, where he just makes the case there's something about, the kind of merchant cultures that are Britain and the United States. And you can say that's the role of ideas and culture. It's ideas and it's all ideas. But it is important that it's no individual's contribution to those ideas, or not in any sort of direct way that we intellectuals like to think, that, we put the big idea out there and then it gets picked up and then it gets somehow acted on. At best, maybe I would like concede, who was it? Was it Keynes who said that we're all slaves to some dead philosopher from centuries ago. It's some ideas concocted by some dead philosopher from like a century ago.
The dead white man, to be precise.
Yeah. Yeah, it was Keynes who said that. He was a big social justice warrior. No, but I don't know. Whatever. That's sort of, that's where I'm coming from. So I'm just sort of throwing that out there on that tweet thread too.
But isn't there a risk here of confirmation bias, that you search out things that confirm this hobby horse of yours? And so obviously you'll be excited that there is something that seems to support this.
So what are you, a scientist? You do like randomized trials on your hobby horses and ideas, and you're like, how can I ensure? Yeah, I don't know if that's right,
But you've been saying this for a while. I think there was also a tweet that you had a few weeks back where you were making the point that if we're talking about innovation, Europe is so behind, and they're just basically using American tech, and that's about it. And I think you keep on coming back to this theme that there is something about America in terms of the kind of creativity and innovation it can unleash. And it's just remarkable how behind schedule, or even let's say backwards, Europe is. And, obviously liberals don't like to think about Europe, and specifically Western Europe, as being backwards. But in any number of ways, they seem to be that. So I'm curious, like, because I think you say in this most recent thread, here's what you say. Demir says, "Not sure how else to put it, but never bet against America. I say it all the time to my European friends, especially when they are most horrified by my adopted home. I don't get it either. I'm some kind of awful intellectual after all. But here we are. Don't bet against America."
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, I mean, look, this is a long-standing thread that you and I have, and actually we boost each other on when we get down about things. I mean, I felt you were a little down in your Monday note this week on America, even though you come out on the side of, America is in fact great despite the darkness. I felt like even there you were dwelling a bit too much on the darkness, but you know,
Interesting.
it is what it
Can you
is.
say more about
No,
that?
I mean that was just an
Well,
impression.
of course, we'll include a link in the show notes. This came out on July
Yeah.
4th. I probably would have written it regardless, but it was timed nicely with Independence Day. So I guess I have been reflecting about
Yeah.
America, but just not, but also because so much has gone on in recent weeks with Dobbs ruling, abortion, the Supreme Court. I mean, it is a time to be panicked about the future of America. So I think it is important to take a step back and take stock of where we're at. Like, how bad is America today?
Right.
And yeah, so tell me, why did you think I was a little bit too depressing
Well, I
there?
don't know. I mean, I guess it's because offline we've been having conversations, and we'll probably have a bit of that conversation now about how maybe it's not all that bad, like the Dobbs ruling and the rest of this. I mean, I sort of took a stab at it the week before in the Monday note. Again, going after one of my hobby horses, which is Americans' obsessions with rights and how that makes things less tenable and less workable. And I mean, I felt like you. I mean, I take your point. It's a serious moment right now, and there's a lot of thinking and reflection that needs to happen about the moment that we face. But there's also a lot of unnecessary panic, I think, at this moment about a lot of this stuff. It's not to minimize that the changes aren't going to be profound and they're not going to be wrenching and perhaps painful, but I feel like over the last few weeks maybe you've oscillated a bit. Like as when you sat down to write this essay, you were more pensive and gloomy, but in general, I've heard you at least say and have thoughts about how rulings like this actually, might be good, basically on democratic first principles. That it's a path perhaps for a healthier republic, and that's not to whitewash the Supreme Court completely. It's not to agree with originalism completely, but just perhaps in the narrow case of Dobbs that it might be healthy. And
Yeah, fair enough. So in my piece though, I didn't actually dwell on Dobbs or abortion. So the reason for my relative darkness was broader, and it's something that I've said quite a bit on this podcast and also personally in our conversations, which is I don't think America is the most pleasant place to live if you want to enjoy your life. So if the goal is happiness, and I make this contrast vis-a-vis Western Europe, where you go to Italy or Spain or France, there's a certain kind of leisurely pace. There isn't the same meritocratic rat race, and people just sort of accept their lives and enjoy their long leisurely lunches and their naps during the day. I'm being slightly stereotypical here in regards to the Spanish, but I think there is something about a different what's it called, tempo, a different tempo of life. and people aren't as ambitious. And I think whoever's spent time really anywhere in Europe can sense this. There isn't this same preoccupation with striving, with unbridled ambition all the time. People's work hours are different. They're not always thinking about the next article they're going to write or what their boss is emailing them. I mean, France has been a pioneer in so-called right to disconnect laws, where they actually put restrictions on, how intense employers can be with their employees outside of work hours. And of course, there's paid family leave, so on and so forth. So it's also a policy question. But and I think, but that's also what makes America great and innovative and exciting and vibrant and messy and alive, because it's all there. It's like a Jackson Pollock painting, and that can quite literally be messy, but the beauty is in the messiness. And I keep on coming back to this conclusion that the bad and the good of America are hard to disentangle, and I think we have to be careful about messing with the formula, because if we did try to become more like Denmark, we would also, it might be better in certain ways, but we would also lose some of what makes America American. Maybe that trade-off is worth it, but we have to be aware that there is a trade-off.
Yeah, I mean, right. And we'll have Nick Burns on, I think, either next week or the week after to talk about his essay, which, you pivot off of, and it is just really good, I think. So maybe we should save some of that. I didn't read the Atlantic piece on meritocracy, which you actually used to pivot off of as well. I think you mentioned that the piece itself sort of suffers at the end, like with that last third problem with sort of like big ideas.
Yeah, the problem of the last third, which is like very few books can really escape this, but it was very striking in this regard, because there's been a bunch of books against meritocracy in recent years. That's become like a thing that people have kind of zeroed in on. But like when it comes to the solutions, there aren't obvious solutions. But that's the problem with a lot of these debates. There aren't obvious solutions to most problems, and not all problems have solutions in the first place. But I think the basic argument here from Daniel Markovits is on meritocracy is meritocracy doesn't make us happier. So meritocracy, it's not so much that it's bad for the poor, or it's bad for the less skilled or the less smart or the less educated. It's also bad for the meritocrats themselves. The ones who benefit from the very system end up suffering from it.
Right. But I mean, I guess that ties into my thread in some way. And I mean, it's what you're saying about, what makes America this Jackson Pollock painting. But it's more than that. I think it leads to America defining the world in a lot of ways. And sure, I mean, I guess it's making it a little bit more miserable, but you know what I mean? It's one of those, I don't know, complaints that actually seems grounded in not that much. I mean, yeah, sure, I guess Europeans have better social safety nets. They have also, I think, higher unemployment in general. They rebound much more slowly. They had a hell of a time after 2008, whereas America comparatively, rebounded. May again have a hell of a time after this war, whereas I think, unless war comes to America's shores for geographic reasons, for like productivity reasons, for the rest of it, we'll just be better off. And I mean, I guess it gets down to maybe another sort of hobby horse of mine is a lot of the happiness studies stuff, right? I mean, there's a lot on it. And I know you're reading more of that stuff, and sort of and I know there are these sociological studies and surveys that self-reported happiness, and they try to account for different things. It just seems to me like a really fraught category, and one especially make it self-reported stuff. Don't you find that it's I don't know, just not that convincing?
Yeah, I'm skeptical about it, but what can you do besides self-reported measures for happiness? I mean, at some level, all of this is subjective, so we do have to ask people how they feel, and how they feel is obviously socially constructed. In some countries, you're encouraged to be pessimistic when people ask you how you're doing, even though you might actually be enjoying your life. There's like a social desirability thing, and if you live in Norway, it's almost like you think you should be happy because you know things are pretty awesome, at least in terms of a very generous welfare state. So even if you're depressed, and it's really cold there, obviously some parts of the year, you'll still like tell pollsters, oh yeah, like and also I think in these more traditionally homogenous societies that are in some ways also more conformist, that there's not as much weirdness that is being encouraged because smaller, more homogenous societies, high levels of trust, a sort of collectivist ethos. You kind of depend on the state. The state is more central in people's lives. You're sort of you're not going to diverge from the consensus too much. So there's all these different factors that lead people to respond in different ways to questions around. So you take it with a grain of salt, but what else can you really do? I would say one little interesting anecdote, and obviously anecdotes are not data. Well, there's no reason this would be. This is a very odd sentiment I heard when I was in California last year. And for our dear listeners who wondered where we were last week, we went a little bit longer between episodes. I was on a bit of a personal retreat in the remote, obscure coasts of Northern California, and I went further up north than I have before. So I was at a conference in Napa Valley, Faith Angle Forum, which focuses on the role of religion in public life. And then I thought, well, I'm in California, let me take some time off and reflect and read. So I went a few hours north of San Francisco. I don't know if you've heard of Sea Ranch or Elk or Point Arena, these sorts of places.
Like the Oregon border, like nearby, that far north, or just closer to San Francisco? Okay.
No, it's not the Lost Coast, because I guess there's a part of the coastline that actually doesn't have a highway because it was too rugged. I didn't go all the way up north, but it was still pretty rugged and chilly and not a lot of people, which the misanthropic side of me loves. Anyway, on my way back, I was passing through Stanford. I just want to clarify for our dear listeners, including friends who expect that if I'm in San Francisco, we should hang out. I take your point. I was only passing through for the night. I want to clarify that, and I had an event. But at this event, there was someone there, and I hadn't met him before. He said something which I thought was so hardcore pro-American, and I was like, damn. He said, I was sort of sharing my concerns about the meritocratic aspects of American life that maybe make us miserable, and I was pushing him on that, but he said something like, America is the closest thing that we've ever had to a living paradise in human history. And it was such an unapologetic, like he wasn't like qualifying, like here I am being like, yeah, I love America. America's great, but, and he's like, get out of here, man. He was being nice about it. Come on,
take it seriously. But take it seriously,
awesome.
Though, I mean, take it seriously in the sense that like question the sort of happiness surveys, because what is happiness? Again, yes, sure, we have no alternative except sort of self-measured stuff. Is happiness? I remember it was Tyler Cowen's book. Gosh, what was it called? The one he was sort of reasonably famous for about the coming technological displacement of all of us and stuff like that. And he had some really dystopian sort of passages in there. Yeah.
Oh, the Great Replacement?
The Great Replacement, but
no.
Tyler Cowen's.
I think it's the great. I think it's the great something though. Maybe the Great Divergence.
Tyler Cowen's The Great Replacement.
Anyway,
theory,
whatever.
Where machines replace us and not immigrants, but. Well, no, I mean, but he had some sort of these, and I think he got pilloried for that a lot because, Tyler's a very rationalist thinker. I think he's, very considers this stuff and he doesn't sort of shy away from this sort of stuff. But, he talks about the fact that in fact, we may become so rich, in fact, that we might be able to, through technology, just basically give certain kinds of living subsidies to people that don't actually contribute and aren't able to interface with machines so much, and be given like a PlayStation and some sort of narcotics, and like
Wait, seriously? That's fascinating. I just didn't
hamburgers
know that
and
was his
like
argument.
live your life.
Wait, now you're just wait, are you being serious now?
So
Hamburgers,
this book
narcotics,
came out
and
a really long
PlayStation?
time ago, and I read it while I was at the magazine, because you sort of have to like speed read some of these things to get through it. And I remember it was Bill Galston in the Wall Street Journal who really took him to task for this book, and for this sort of like possible thing. I do remember that. So I hope I'm not doing too much injustice to Tyler's argument. I almost certainly am. But anyway, never mind the actual content of Tyler's argument. And just to point out that I think happiness doesn't mean comfort, and it doesn't mean leisure and the ability to basically do nothing. I mean, that was the other really weird thing in like Marx's idea of what happiness is, right? Is like some level of material prosperity where you can like fish in the morning, I don't know, woodwork in the afternoon, and build a car in the evening, or whatever the hell he said, right? And it's just, it doesn't correspond with human nature. Obviously, leisure is an important thing, but it's not the whole thing, and it's not happiness. Happiness is creating something. And I think that's what America gets really well, is that it empowers people to make shit all the time, and empowers them to just like go break shit and then make shit and just start again and do it again. And yeah, that's demanding, but it certainly leads to a more vibrant and better society, I think, a more dynamic society. I can argue that maybe
Dynamic, but a more dynamic society, not necessarily a better
sure,
society,
subjective.
which is a very subjective word.
So what is better?
What is
and
better?
I guess that's what gets at my sort of ideas don't matter argument, and this whole sort of like passiveness of that without sort of intervention of ideas, America's dynamism leads it to be the most prosperous and most sort of world-defining power, and has for the last 100-odd years. Now, maybe that's not an end in and of itself, and maybe but that's certainly a hard metric that one can say that despite adversity, it keeps bouncing back, and it creates, and it makes stuff. It sets the tempo. And by doing that, by being the pace setter, the trend setter, it leads to not being beholden to anyone else. Ultimately, partly again, it's the gift of geography. Neighbors that can't threaten it, a sense of security, massive, again, land endowments, and the ability to do this sort of stuff. But there's I guess I would say there's something that one can latch onto there, is to not be bullied by anyone else. That's a sense of success, a sense of, I don't know. So this is where like my not really attaching or really feeling like I need to attach questions like, is it good or not? I would just say that it's something that it affords us. And so maybe that's how I would take your interlocutor's thing seriously. I mean, it allows individuals the ability to just make stuff all the time. And that collectively leads to a society that then leads to a society that basically, sets the pace for the world, if it doesn't run it, And again, it's a conversation we've had before. When all the chips are down, all the talk about China and all the rest of this, I think that will surprise them in the end. I don't know how, and I don't think any intellectual knows exactly how that's going to work.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with you. In the fight against China, there's no doubt in my mind who will come out victorious. And in that sense, we both come to the same conclusion, although perhaps for different reasons. I would probably emphasize more the ideological aspect and the moral aspect, that because we're a democracy, we are destined to eclipse a competing
But for me, it's interesting that I don't think it's the democratic nature that makes America a world beater. I guess that's what I'm getting at also, Now, obviously...
But we couldn't be a world beater if we were authoritarian. I get that that's not what you emphasize, but the two go hand in hand, the innovative aspect and the sense of vibrancy and
loosely governed,
chaotic
right?
creation.
That's the interesting thing.
That is only
It's not that we
yeah.
are governed by consent, though it would be hard to loosely govern anything without some consensus mechanism. And to have this kind of looseness in the governance, I think you need, I guess, some kind of ill-functioning democracy. And I mean, maybe that's part of it too. You know what I mean? Like, if you had too good of a democracy, maybe it wouldn't work that well. Because if you had like an effective democracy that actually managed to govern more, maybe that wouldn't be good. I don't know. I'm just now spitballing here.
Yeah, here. Okay, now you're onto something, because
Yeah.
what do we mean when we say effectiveness? An effective government means a stronger state in some way, where a state is getting things done or being efficient or providing services more effectively. And that's what Western European states are known for, and that's why the state is more present in people's everyday lives. And but that would mean less room for the chaotic creativity that we're talking about here. So I think there definitely is a link here, that maybe be careful what you wish for. You want good government, but you don't want too good government. You want good enough government. And once you start getting into a very effective state like the Norwegian state or the Danish state, that comes at a cost, because as I think we've both said in different ways at different times, life is about trade-offs, but so is politics. And if you have too much of one good thing, you'll have less of another good thing. You cannot have your cake and eat it. So there's no way you're going to have a vibrant, crazy Silicon Valley where people are just like bonkers and do crazy shit, but also create amazing shit in Norway. Like, that's why there isn't. I mean, there is technology obviously in Norway, but there isn't going to be a Silicon Valley
that
in Norway.
Tweet thread you were referring to earlier, I just remembered that was actually based on someone else's tweet that I was actually surprised. Doesn't actually surprise me on reflection. I just didn't expect it. It was Gary Kasparov was saying about Europe just sort of being backwards on a lot of technology stuff. That they don't invent stuff. Well,
there's too much regulation. The EU. I mean, you'll know more about this than I do. I don't want to speak out of turn here about the nature of European regulations and the role of the EU in all of this, but it's just like harder to get things done when there's just a lot. There's a lot that constrains. Where I think what defines America is being free from constraint. And our friend Bruno Machais was saying this the other day in response to this point that I was making, that Americans engage in what he calls, and this is originally from Susan Sontag decades ago, in dream politic, where there's a kind of unreality to the way we live, and that unreality is actually good, because it means we are not constrained by history, and it means we are not constrained by reality. We can transcend our own reality. Where Europe, I think, also by virtue of historical events and two devastating world wars, has always felt very tied to reality. It cannot afford to be unconstrained by it.
No, it's right. All I was going to say, though, and I got some pushback on that tweet thread. I forget. There's one guy in particular went after me on it. And it was, points well taken, saying that, there are other limits to Europe's ability, even though it is a common market, it's not a common language, it's harder to sort of travel, that, they haven't really put their back into some of this like technology stuff, and so there's more fragmentation that leads to that. And you take that on the one hand. The other thing that I think is worth pointing out is that Germany is an insanely successful society. They're perhaps about to have their lunch eaten from them because they're not adaptable enough, and that gets to that inventiveness. But they, through a kind of ability to cooperate, legislate to a large extent. They managed to follow orders very well, but they are certainly were leaders in factory and machine technology, right? I mean, it's sort of a marvel, but it's not clear to me whether they're going to make the leap into what's next. That's the other part, Whereas America, was great in cars, and then for example, they couldn't have been an Elon Musk in Germany, even though they're such a car culture and have invented that. They just, they were slow to that, and it's like impossible to imagine, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, good point.
So yeah, I mean, with those caveats, it's interesting to hear you though talk about this, because I think you and I, when we talk about these things about democracy, I tend to push you on the moral element, which I've noticed over like the last year or so you've been also, I think, leaning into more, and I think it's right that you are, about democracy. Shouldn't necessarily have good outcomes for it to be desirable, and that it has a sort of intrinsic moral worth in and of itself. But I think we just hit on something different that I haven't actually heard you say, that maybe a virtue of a democracy is that it in fact doesn't work all that well, which is a slightly different thing than I've heard you say before. That is to say that in fact, by it not working that well, it creates space for the individual. It creates kind of freedom. I mean, that's a weird, like, democratic minimalist libertarian sort of argument, maybe, but it is very intrinsic to America. Like, one of these things is that, constitutionally, the whole Constitution is set up to be somewhat dysfunctional, to have blockages at all sorts of levels, to actually give room to individuals, to creativity, to actually make it work, because it's so big and rambunctious and hard to sort of keep in one place. It's one thing that drives me sort of insane about liberals when they talk about, especially in light of any number of crises that we've been under lately, right? These ideas that the Constitution is unjust. It like favors the other side. And we can debate about that, but what we need to do is like refound the country and like come up with some sort of new constitutional arrangement. Not recognizing that if you actually were to call together a constitutional convention right now, you couldn't refound the country. I don't think you could. All the challenges that were there at the start, all the stuff that's built into the Constitution that leads to the kind of gridlock, is there because we still have the same sort of arrangement we did at the founding. Small states, less populous states, poorer states versus richer, larger, more industrialized, more prosperous states. They all have interests. I mean, you could abolish states. I mean, we talked to our friend Nils Gilman like 2 years ago about that idea, just abolish all states and refound the government that way. But even when you think about that, that would perhaps lead to a different kind of democracy than we have, but it would maybe lead to a more totalizing and more effective democracy, which would be bad.
Yeah. And that's why I don't want to mess with a winning formula. For all of our faults, America works pretty good relative to human history. And for people who come up with these neo-utopian schemes of refounding America, look, maybe it would lead to some pretty interesting, even quote-unquote good outcomes. Certainly maybe more economic equality or something like that. But, I mean, do you want to mess with the formula? Because then America won't be America anymore. It would be something else. And I think that, I don't know if that makes me or us small c conservatives. I think as I've gotten older, I have become more reticent about the idea of just too much social or political, institutional, electoral engineering. Actually, I'm fine with electoral engineering because that's a little bit more narrow and specific, and I feel like there's a lot of good academic literature on better systems of government that I know we disagree on that. I mean, I think that I can be open to persuasion on like a more of a parliamentary system in the US, but even that would be risky because again, you're messing with a formula that's done us well for a long time now. I think your point on I like this idea about dysfunction being a virtue, because I think that's actually getting to something much deeper. I mean, if you think about the most interesting people you know as individuals, and this also goes for just like artists or writers or the people that we admire the most, or at least the people I admire the most, oftentimes they are very complex characters. They are not straightforward, like 9 to 5 family men who are totally predictable. They're a little bit messy. And maybe that's where great writing and great art and great films come from. You need some level of dysfunction in an individual to be truly visionary and innovative on that scale. Maybe that's not the most important thing in the world. Maybe it's better to have someone who's solid and reliable. But again, we go to the trade-off. And if we can sort of make that same argument on the level of states and systems and democracies, that you actually do want some dysfunction baked into your system, because what goes
Yeah.
for individuals goes for systems. And for, I mean, I think there's something really important there that is, I think, hard for people to admit because they want things to work all the time. We want to solve problems and, oh, if we can only have better policy, and let's find a better policy through expertise. And that's why I think we've had a long running theme on the podcast that we are skeptical of too much expertise and too much experts, because experts want to undo dysfunction. They see dysfunction as something to be addressed
Right. No,
through
totally.
technocratic
Right.
policy making.
So,
Right?
so it's interesting.
So
Then,
what?
what's your attitude towards ideas then? Because I guess we've never really explored that. Then is on the one hand the importance of ideas, on the other hand the problems with expertise. Now, I mean, I was actually texting with our friend Sam Kimbriel about this earlier today. Right? It's there's a danger when we talk about ideas that we say, well, it's all ideas, and you can't have anything, without ideas. Like life is ideas. Life is people interacting with each other, and ideas happen. Events, dear boy, happen, as I think Sam put it to me, and then like you reach for whatever is nearby, and that's an idea, and that lets you move forward, and that's the role of ideas. But there's something about what we don't like about expertise, that we don't like about technocracy, that I think I'm also trying to get at in that tweet thread about why America is great, is that, yeah, it works despite all that. That the salvation is not in that. And so maybe I overstate my point by being against ideas, but I think, I think you can at least approach where I'm coming from on this in your dislike for experts. And again, we had we had our conversation recently about expertise, and obviously, we're not Luddites. Vaccines work. We're both vaccinated. Good shit. But there's something there about, and I think it's probably cultural, because we sort of inhabit this milieu of overeducated people working in this sort of space of ideas, that we maybe overestimate its importance and overestimate our role in it, and that it's important to recognize that like if America makes it through everything, including Trump and Trumpism and the rise of that sort of stuff, it will be like the sum of a bunch of things that make America America, and not any single intervention of any individual or like the role or like the transformative idea that somehow like gets us out of it. And I'd include in that things like liberalism that we've spent a lot of time talking about on this show. You know what I mean? Like, oh, is liberalism good? Is it bad? Like, what's an anti-liberal, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe none of that really matters,